Back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 24th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Utah and congressional gerrymandering and the 2026 midterm elections as a judge is set to rule tomorrow or sometime in this upcoming week around Utah's congressional maps, detailing whether or not they believe that Utah violated constitutional authority in rescinding the independent redistricting commission in the state and ultimately drawing a 4-seat partisan Republican gerrymander in this state. Now, Utah is an overwhelmingly conservative state. Donald Trump won this state in the last election by a massive 21 percentage points. But when it comes down to actual support on a state and district-by-district basis, Donald Trump didn't always do so well in some of these congressional districts, at least ones that had been drawn prior to the 2020 census. And that really spurred a whole level of conversation around the state of Utah, a state with an overwhelming conservative majority. Republicans have dominated the governor's mansion as well as both chambers in the state legislature here. But voters in the 2018 midterm elections passed what Utah referred to as Proposition 4. It was a ballot measure that established an independent redistricting commission and the ability for statewide Republicans and Democrats to come together and put forth the most fair maps possible in this state. And while it did pass the voters in 2018, the state legislature took it upon themselves in the state Senate to rescind this decision, ultimately defying the will of the voters in the 2020 general session, stripping away right before a census here the independent commission. And that's because in the 2018 midterm elections, Democrats did what many people thought was impossible in Utah, and that was flip a congressional district. The 4th District of Utah voted for Mia Love by 13 points in the 2016 election for 2 years later to go to the Democrats' Ben McAdams by about 0.26%. It was one of the closest races we had seen in a very long time out of the state of Utah, and ultimately what it had done was taken a Republican gerrymander in the state that had been overwhelming in favor of the GOP. In 2012, Democrats barely came across. 2014, very locked in. 2016, even more locked in. Keep in mind, this is after the state of Utah saw a massive shift away from Republicans on the national level, especially when it came down to the presidential vote. Mitt Romney won by about 45 in Utah. Donald Trump won by about 21. So massive reduction here. Mia Love, however, expanded. In fact, Democrats won in this district. By 2018, it had flipped back to the Democratic Party. And in 2020, it was decided by just about 1 point. What the Republicans knew in Utah was that with their legislative majorities, they wanted to ultimately draw the maps so unfavorable the Democrats would have no chance of winning them in the future. And that's exactly what they did. They split Salt Lake City across multiple different districts, and what had resulted in was no districts less than a 26-point margin across this state. A very successful gerrymander, and one that entirely stripped away the Republican Party's ability to have Democratic Party's ability to have any competitive maps in the state of Utah. But as we saw, the Senate bill rescinding that 2018 vote, we have now seen that the courts in Utah don't seem to be too happy about that decision. Back in 2024, the Utah Supreme Court reinstated the challenge to Senate Bill 200 that had repealed the anti-gerrymandering initiative from the 2018 midterms. Essentially, the Utah Supreme Court, which is comprised entirely of Republicans appointed by Republican governors, still decided that the voters made that decision in 2018 and that constitutionally it was wrong for the gerrymandering initiative to be stripped away by the state legislature after the voters made that decision. And because the legislature ignored the recommendations of the independent commission that drew up a map that was a lot more similar to the older one that allowed for 1 competitive district and 3 safe Republican districts, they ignored it, and now the Supreme Court and now state courts are getting involved. Now we're starting to see that a judge who's set to again rule on a decision sometime soon is going to be in a position where ultimately what they say goes. Now, of course, there will be appeals, and this might go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. But in terms of interpretation within the state, it is very possible that a rescinding of an initiative and ignoring constitutional authority that was invested by voters into these independent commissions is something that would be quite, important. And something I could imagine even a partisan conservative court might end up siding with the Democrats on this case. Because what we will find is that there is going to be a number of appeals, but these new maps must be drawn by November 1st, 2025 for them to take place ahead of 2026. And so whether or not that's something that's going to happen It's certainly in conversation, and it says here, the judge has indicated that her decision will be issued on Monday. That is tomorrow. We'll talk about it from what we are seeing. Guarantee there will be appeals in either direction, but the idea here is that if it is struck down, if the congressional map from 2024 is reverted back to one that seems a little bit more similar to 2020, that provides Democrats an opportunity to win a congressional district in a state that hasn't even been discussed. Texas passed their new maps. Republicans are in a very solid and locked-in position there. Democrats are likely set to pass their maps in California after the November 4th election. That one is also in the works. Indiana's looking like it's going to call their special session to redraw their map. Missouri looks like it's going to follow suit. Governor Wes Moore today just explored the idea that he might go into the state of Maryland and redraw the maps there. We're finding that across the board. Democrats and Republicans in their respective states are looking to make a move. But in Utah, it's not Democrats who are going to be, in this, that have control of the state legislature and the governorship, that are redrawing the maps. It is a conservative court and conservative judges that might end up siding with the Democratic Party on this case, because they've already indicated as such that they weren't necessarily happy with the decisions in the past to go ahead and just overrule, decisions that were made by the voters. This 2018 initiative is one that will be very integral and important for the ruling that we are likely to get tomorrow. Because what we have seen is that there has been this long-standing argument from a number of different Democratic groups that Utah is a gerrymander, that this map is not indicative and not representative of the vote share in the state, and arguably, that is correct. Every single district here is more conservative than the entire state. That doesn't even make sense. The only way that works is because these districts have been drawn in a way that dilutes significant chunks of Democratic vote share, that when you take a look at a county map, you'll see exactly what I mean when I talk about diluting. Around here, where you have massive vote shares, massive amounts of Democratic Party pockets, these are the areas that Republicans decided to crack a multitude of ways, and arguably in a way that benefited them tremendously. Right? What we know, we'll just show you the example of the state-by-state comparison. Look at the blue, the pockets up here. Look at how they're split across 4 different districts here. They all take a piece of Salt Lake City. It doesn't even make sense. In 2020, at least, it wasn't as egregious. Yes, it was still a map that favored Republicans, but still, Democrats had a fighting chance in a singular district, and arguably, that's just how some of these maps are drawn. But this one is extreme, and it is one that Democrats and Republicans both know is, in fact, a gerrymander. They don't rescind and revoke laws like this for no reason. There was intentionality behind this map. There was a purpose behind the way they did things, because they tried to make it in a way that was tremendously beneficial to the GOP, and arguably they succeeded. So we'll keep our eyes peeled. From what we are hearing from the state of Utah is that there might very well be a ruling to overturn the congressional maps tomorrow that will again inevitably be appealed by, the Republican groups in the state, if that is the decision. I imagine if it goes the other way, Democratic groups will also make the appeal. But as it stands right now, Utah's gerrymandering lawsuit might really screw up the Republican Party in terms of this state in particular. Because what they have been counting on is all of their states lock in, follow suit, and end up being more pro-Republican than they might have been in the 2024 election, and Utah's coming out of left field as some state that isn't even really prompted by Democratic judges or, a Democratic legislature or a Democratic governor. This is purely the making of Republicans defying the will of the voters, not listening to the recommendations of the Independent Commission and bypassing them to every degree. And now the state court is saying, that's not the way you do things. And so Diana Gibson, who is likely to rule tomorrow, we will cover likely the results of that one, unless it looks like it's going to be just inevitable appeals, which is a very strong case and compelling one that might be the case. But as it stands today, this is a state I didn't even have on my radar, wasn't even tracking as potentially being an upset to some degree for the Republican Party. Because right now they need to invest $0 into Utah. None of these races, even in 2026, will be competitive. To show you just how conservative they are, if you actually take a look, I don't even think we can do it here, but if we take a look at what a shift would look like to get yourself to a point where Democrats are winning in any of the districts in Utah, it would be quite tremendous. You would have to shift the national environment by 15 points. And even then, Democrats still don't win one, and they're at 257 seats. It would take an additional, 10 points to get one district blue, which means if that was a national shift, Democrats would be at 305 seats. Obviously not the case, but that's all, not all, but that's what it takes to even get one district in Utah to being lean for the Democratic Party. When in 2020, they were just a point behind. You know, when you think about that and put it into perspective, this Utah gerrymander, again, is a successful one. It is a very, very well-drawn gerrymander. But in terms of its constitutional basis, in terms of its viability in a court system that doesn't seem to like them already, might not hold up. And, you know, whatever is ruled will be the decision that comes forth and might make that case, right? Let's say the Utah Supreme Court doesn't listen to the appeal, United States Supreme Court also doesn't hear the appeal, then you're going to find that, yes, the map will be redrawn. I imagine this will be drawn out and prolonged, and Republicans, I think, are hoping that even if they lose this court case, that the decision will mean it will have to take into effect in 2028 and not 2026, which is a strong possibility as well. But in either case, Democrats are finding themselves fighting for a new map in Utah, and it looks like it might move in their direction. And so while there's still a bit of time before we actually hear and find out what this ruling is, I'm sure we'll get it in about 24 hours, maybe even less than if they post it in the morning, we will be in a fascinatingly interesting position. Because again, for states like Utah and other states across the country that are going to see legal challenges to their new maps, judges making decisions on behalf of voters in a state based on interpretations of constitutional rights in whatever it might be, will be so incredibly fascinating to watch. Because this whole redistricting battle really reminds me a lot of what we've covered in 2022 when all the new maps were being drawn and the courts were challenging them and X, Y, and Z. But for the case of 2026, Utah might be the next state that will see a forced redraw that might inevitably and ultimately help the Democratic Party across the state, even if that was never the intention of the already Republican courts. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.